Good evening and welcome back to Times Have Changed read through. Last week we read through chapter 1 and you met the heroine of the story, Gwendolyn. Now this week I could be reading through chapter 2 and you shall be meeting Finn, the hero of the story. So sit back, get comfortable, and I shall read you chapter 2 of Times Have Changed. Introduction to the Nimrod. The year is 1032. 10 years had passed since that fateful night. In that time, Gwendolyn had made her impression on the village, and now the villagers could barely remember a time she had not lived with them. She worked as a healer and became a part of their modest yet thriving community. Now springtime in Blostamarket, and the trees blossomed in a variety of pastel colours surrounding the town in a natural confetti rainbow. It was early, and the market stalls were busy shouting and selling to the local masses. Gwendolyn entered the village, walking side by side her tall Frisian horse. Baskets of her deliveries sat on her mare's back. Due to her role in the village and her home deliveries, everyone knew her. She had barely stepped foot in the village and wished many people good morning. She made her way to the butcher's house, buzzing with people. As soon as Gwendolyn entered the butcher's, his face lit up. "Gwen, there you are, right on time." The butcher was as tall as he was large. Although he had a giant beer belly, he was a strong-looking man with rippling muscular forearms due to the nature of his profession. He pushed the other customers away from the counter. "Come on, move! Make way for Gwen, my son is sick." Gwendolyn smiled, throwing a hand at him. "Come on, Philip. Here, I can wait. Your son only has the sniffles." Philip raised a finger in the air. "No, this cannot wait." He rushed from the counter and pulled her away around the back of the shop. "The shop is closed, folks. Back in a matter of minutes." As he disappeared through the door behind the counter, he pulled a very apologetic Gwendolyn, as everybody sighed and moaned, but eventually left with raised voices of disappointment. Philip stopped and looked around nervously to make sure no one was watching, even though they stood in the private quarters of his house, which Gwendolyn found bizarre. He looked back at her, holding both of her hands in his. His voice was but a whisper. "Do you have it?" She smiled and pulled out a small glass vial from her brown leather shoulder sack. "This is for your son. It will make him stop coughing and soothe his throat." His face dropped as if he was expecting something else. "And," she said, raising his hopes, "that special marital aid." He snatched both vials from her hands. Yes, thank you, Gwen." He gave her a big, suffocating hug. "Okay." She tapped his arm to let her go so she could breathe again. "But this is very strong, remember? Like I told you, just 2 drops under the tongue, no more, or you will get stuck like mating dogs." Philip blushed a little, quickly averting his eyes. "Yes, I understand. I already heard what happened between David and his wife." A grimace look passed both of their faces, but they both began to laugh, and as they came to a natural stop, Gwendolyn sweetly looked up at him and asked, "What about my payment?" Philip's eyes grew wider, and then he moved his hand to the back of his head and rubbed the back of his neck nervously. "Look, Gwen, I'm really sorry, but I can't give you any beef or mutton at this time." She sighed and looked sad as she looked up into his eyes with her vast, piercing gaze. "It's the griffin, isn't it?" "Yeah, I had to hide all of the cows and sheep in the barn. They just aren't breeding because they're stressed. But you can have as many chickens as you like." Surprisingly, they're doing well. Gwendolyn smiled, raising her eyes back to his. "Thank you, Philip. Yes, I shall take 4 chickens if that's okay." She sighed. "I really have a taste for beef." "But how long has that contract been out now? Weeks?" I hope Nimrod comes by soon. The butcher shrugged. Yeah, I know. Everyone feels the same, living in fear. Fear that the griffin might get bored of our livestock and start coming after us instead. He held her shoulders and smiled. Look, I promise you, as soon as the griffin is slain and I have new livestock, you could be the first to choose what beef you want. Gwendolyn pouted, acting sad. Probably want chicken by then. They both laughed and Philip fetched for her payment. Gwendolyn took her payment and with a cheerful wave she made her exit past some very disgruntled customers. She smiled nervously as she pushed through the crowd and made her way to her well-behaved mare, Shadow, as she waited for her outside of the shop for her owner. Gwendolyn gave a small smile as she saw passing children pet her legs. She knew Shadow enjoyed the attention. As soon as Shadow saw Gwendolyn, Shadow instantly began to walk towards her. Gwendolyn gave her a huge, toothy white smile. She patted her mare's nose, and took her by the reins to her adoptive father's inn at the Hound and Hare. The beast followed, and followed Gwendolyn obediently. She made her way around the back of the inn to the stables, tied the chickens to Shadow. The mare turned her head to Gwendolyn, looking at Gwendolyn as if displeased by the dead poultry that hung from her saddle. Gwendolyn patted her nose and pulled a carrot from her leather bag that hung around her shoulder. I know, girl, it won't be long. We can go home soon. Shadow was quick to gobble up the carrot and seemed to nod at Gwendolyn as if she was satisfied with her offering. She smiled and made her way to the back entrance of the tavern, straight to the kitchen. Gwendolyn was greeted by the usual warm welcome of her adoptive family. Gwendolyn, my love, come, sit, dinner is almost ready. Daniel smiled while stirring the contents of a large cooking pot. Gwendolyn smiled at Daniel weakly, but she could smell from the stable it was broth, watery, unseasoned broth. She did not show it on her face, but she was not looking forward to eating it. Lottie sat at the table, used to preparing food for guests, but they used it for dining. She poured wine into 3 glasses. Come, Gwen, sit with me. You look tired. Have you been busy? Probably too busy to eat, Daniel shouted from the cooking pot. Gwendolyn rolled her eyes at his comment. She looked to Lottie with a shake of her head. I eat just fine, Daniel. You worry too much. Daniel braced himself as he lifted the heavy cooking pot from the stove. He huffed as he shuffled over to the dining table. Gwendolyn reached out to help, but Daniel shook his head at her. No, come, sit down. Gwendolyn shrugged and did as he asked. You're wasting away, girl. Sit, eat. Gwendolyn took the glass of wine from Lottie and looked at him holding her head in her hand. I'm not, Lottie, please, help me out here. Lottie laughed, looking from Gwendolyn to her father. Yes, Dad, Gwendolyn's right. She just pulls that corset impossibly thin. Underneath it, she's all huge. Gwendolyn pulled a piece of bread from the loaf that sat in the centre of the table and threw it at Lottie. Thanks, Lottie. It's not quite what I meant. They both laughed as Daniel served up dinner, and just as Gwendolyn predicted, it was watery broth, with just a few carrots, cabbage, and barley floating in it. Gwendolyn thought she could count the few ingredients that floated in the water. Thank you, she said, trying to hide her disappointment. Gwendolyn looked over to Lottie, but she kept her eyes low. She was never good at hiding her emotions. She smirked, knowing Lottie was thinking exactly the same as her. Daniel sat down, and they all clinked their wine glasses together. Slowly and begrudgingly, they all began to sup on their hot vegetable water. Gwendolyn pulled off a piece of bread from the loaf, dipping it in the broth. So, how's business been today? Any new punters? Gwendolyn asked, distracting herself from the sorry state of her dinner. Daniel shook his head gravely. Unfortunately not. Just the usual booze hounds. We just don't get the travellers. Or merchants, like we used to. It's that damn griffin, I tell you. It's chasing work out the village. Shame our kingdom doesn't have a Nimrod anymore. She sighed heavily. I'm sure one will come past soon, hopefully. I must admit, I'm getting tired of eating chicken all the time, and that spice merchant hasn't come by in a while. I really miss my kagami and spices. Lottie sighed. I miss your cooking that uses those spices. Gwendolyn looked up to her with a wink. How was your day, Gwen? No offence, but you look tired. Gwendolyn sat back in her chair, holding her glass of wine to her lips. I am. I don't know why. Everything's going well. Very few people are sick. I mainly deal in marital aids and love potions at the moment. She sighed, looking away. I'm happy. I'm just... She paused, looking for the right words. Daniel interrupted her. You're bored and you need a suitor. Start a family. Gwendolyn looked at him wide-eyed. Well, I wouldn't quite put it like that, but yeah, I think everything's just a bit monotonous these days. Just need to change, do something different. It's no surprise, Gwen. You have been coming to the village every day for the past 8 years to take care of us all. You have dined with us, then ride home to drink your wine and smoke your pipe. I think you deserve a break. But what were you thinking of doing? Again, Daniel piped up. Maybe court one of the villagers. You have many admirers around here, Gwen. Gwendolyn smiled with a sigh. I am aware of certain men's interests in me in this village, but it's difficult to feel the same way back when you've seen all their pus, boil, and other ailments. So are you saying you'll never settle down? Daniel asked. Gwendolyn sighed heavily, looking into her glass of wine. I don't know, Daniel. It's complicated. She shrugged, looking up to his eyes from her long dark eyelashes. I hope, maybe one day, I'll meet someone. I'm just very particular. Is it to do with your past? Gwendolyn nodded. Daniel knew better than to ask any more. He still remembered the sorry state that she was in when she arrived in the village, and he knew better than to ask her about her life before arriving in the village. He could only imagine the pain that she had experienced before they had met. I'm sorry, Gwen, I didn't mean to bring up a sore point. She shook her head with a smile. Please, honestly, it's fine. Suddenly, a loud ring from a bell echoed from behind the bar. Lottie jumped at the sudden sound and held her chest, breathing heavier. Daniel stood up quickly. Sorry, girls, I'll be right back. Carry on eating without me. Daniel ran to the bar to see a customer. As soon as he left, both Lottie and Gwendolyn looked at each other with raised eyebrows. Is it me, or is his cooking getting worse? Gwendolyn asked quietly. Lottie burst out into a fit of laughter. My God, it really is. I mean, what even is this? Barley floating in hot water? They both chuckled. Gwendolyn drew closer to Lottie, taking hold of her bowl. Say we throw this out the window, quick, before he returns. Lottie nodded, laughing quickly. Gwendolyn grabbed hold of the bowl and ran to the window to pour out the contents. Quickly she sat back in her seat, hearing Daniel's return. She put the bowl back in front of Lottie. Both women dipped their bread into the bowl, pretending that they had finished and clearing up the last few morsels with bread. Daniel sat down. He looked at both of them, surprised. Wow, you girls were hungry. There's more in the pot if you want it. Both girls put up their hand in protest. No, thank you, I'm just so full, Gwendolyn said, giving Lottie a wink. Who was that? Lottie asked. Oh, it's just Jim. He just wanted another flagon. Gwendolyn waited for Daniel to finish his dinner. She slowly began to move from her seat as he finished. I'm afraid I must take my leave. I still have some work to do. So soon? I understand, Gwen. The village is far too dependent on you. She gave a small smile, and I am dependent on Blostamarket. We all need each other. But do take a break, Gwen. If you need it, everyone will understand. She smiled, hugging Daniel. I know. I'll think about it. See you tomorrow. Lottie jumped up. I'll walk you out. Gwendolyn nodded softly and waited for Lottie to walk to her side before walking out. They both walked side by side to the stables. My dad is right. Dad is right, you know. If you need some time to yourself, we would all understand. Gwendolyn smiled as she patted Shadow. Thank you, Lottie. I'll think about it. I just don't know what else I would do. Lottie giggled before she spoke. Maybe you could ride around the kingdom and look for a Nimrod to slay this griffin? Gwendolyn pouted and jumped up on her high horse with the ease of a person sitting on a chair. But Lottie was used to Gwendolyn's acrobatics. But what surprised Lottie was how Gwendolyn always performed such acrobatics in incredibly tight-fitted dresses, yet they never tore. She looked down at Lottie with a smile. You know what? Maybe I will. Lottie moved out of the way of Shadow and waved as Gwendolyn rode away. The day began to darken. Gwendolyn looked up at the sky with a heavy sigh, as she knew she still had much work to do when she got home. She jumped off of Shadow as she reached her house, pulling her mare from her bags. Gwendolyn walked inside of her home with Shadow following closely behind, but her mare was too big to fit through the front door, so Shadow stood by the porch looking at Gwendolyn curiously. She returned to Shadow, giving her another carrot. She removed her saddle and patted her on the back. Girl, I need to brush you, but I'm afraid it will have to wait until tomorrow. Shadow blew air from her nose in a huff and walked off as if unimpressed with the lack of grooming. Gwendolyn smiled and sat on her alchemic desk. She pulled back her long raven locks in a red silk ribbon and set to work on all the potions and elixirs needed to bottle up for the next day's deliveries. Gwendolyn sat back in her chair with her. She pulled her hair loose and sighed. Finally, with her work finished, she could relax for the evening. Lighting her pipe with a taper on a nearby candle, she filled a goblet of wine and made her way outside. She smiled to herself. This was a favourite part of her day, especially in the warmer months, as she could sit by the river and stargaze. She smiled, looking to Shadow, who sat next to her, finding it cooler to sleep outside than in her stable. Gwendolyn sat down close to her horse, patting the mare's stomach, and as she sat cross-legged with her back to Shadow's stomach, What do you think I should do, Shadow? Gwendolyn talked to her horse in a quiet voice as she stared up at the stars. Should I leave the village for a while? Maybe try and find a Nimrod like Lottie joked about? Gwendolyn took a deep breath of her pipe and slowly blew the smoke into the air. Remember, Shadow, the last Nimrod we met? Gwendolyn said, elbowing Shadow softly. The horse grunted. Gwendolyn bit at her lower lip, remembering. Long, raven curls. Tall, broad. So big he made me feel tiny in his arms. She drank slowly from her glass, looking distant into her memory. What I would give to feel the heat of a man again. She sighed, looking down into her glass of wine. She swirled it and took another long drag of her pipe. Slowly she blew the smoke from her lungs and looked about the blue hue of her surroundings lit by the full moon. I love my life here. I would not change it for the world, but she let her words die in her mouth as she held her pipe to her lips, staring at the sky. Meanwhile, not too far away, a silver-haired monster hunter, a disgraced Nimrod, roamed the cave, utterly untouched by any source of light. In the darkness, all that could be seen was the glimmer of his silver pearlescent eyes. Traversing the cave silently, he paused at the slightest sound. Even dressed in armour of padded leather, chainmail, and animal hide, he did not make a single sound as he climbed down the damp, craggy rocks. A scuttling sound echoed from a distance. He jumped down to an open area of the cave. He knelt to the floor with his eyes closed and laid his hand on the floor, feeling the vibrations, but he found it challenging to pinpoint the direction of where the sound was coming from. He had a bad feeling in his gut. Something was wrong. As he stood up, he suddenly heard the crunch beneath his foot. It was a single piece of eggshell. He gulped, and as his eyes widened, he looked down at what he had just stood on. It's a nest, he thought. He was not prepared for this battle. He needed to escape. He needed to rethink his plan of attack before it was too late. 4 5-foot long, pure black, and what looked like elongated scorpion insects charged at him. This particular insect was not only well armoured, but highly poisonous. He had to keep his distance. Leaping back, he threw a small round hand bomb in the monster's direction. This broke the armour of 2 of the creatures, and sent them into a screaming frenzy. The screaming was so loud, so high-pitched, it hurt his ears. Quickly he pulled out his crossbow and shot both monsters in the head. He smiled. This is it. I just need room to escape. He ran at full speed to the exit, but the remaining 2 were faster still. Both creatures moved towards the cave's exit, ready to attack the disgraced Nimrod. In a panic, he pulled his forearms together in front of his face as if blocking. Once joined, the tattoos on each arm glowed a brilliant green. "Bragang!" he yelled. The spell created a magical force like a strong gust of wind that propelled him from the venomous sting of their hide as they reared up at him like scorpions. It worked, but he landed on his back. Another insect appeared. It instantly pushed his legs on either side of his neck, pinning him to the spot. It wanted to poison him. The disgraced Nimrod felt the rumble of the ground, and he knew yet another 2 were rushing fast towards him. Quickly, before the ever-enclosing stinger could touch him, he grabbed the dagger from his belt and pushed the blade into the insect's soft underbelly. As the creature fell limp on top of him, he tried to force himself from the pinchers around the creature's mouth. But before he could get to his feet, one insect had him pinned by the legs, while another tried to make short work of his face. Whilst he desperately wriggled from side to side, trying to avoid his head being crushed, he gritted his teeth, feeling the pinchers pierce his legs. He had 1 bomb left. He held his dagger to protect his face from the pinchers and the venomous stingers, and as the creature reared at him in frustration, he pushed the bomb into its mouth. Swiftly, he again began to hold his forearms together. He screamed, "Bragan!" at the creature. It gave him enough lift for the disgraced Nimrod to swing his dagger at the insect's face, but that held his legs, and without hesitation he rolled away. The insect landed, and it stared at him and screamed, and as it exploded into 1,000 pieces, painting the cave with its internals. Rage was beginning to set in, and the disgraced Nimrod had no desire to escape anymore. He wanted these things dead. Gritting his teeth, he approached the final creature. The creature looked less than confident without its family. The disgraced Nimrod raised one hand and pulled his long sword from its sheath in the other. He His face was heavily cast in shadow, which made his features look monstrous. He held up his left hand, outstretched to the creature. The tattoo on his hand of a fire spell glowed a brilliant bright red. "For's Wayland," he screamed. Suddenly the beast was engulfed by a roaring fire, and as it screamed in pain, it began running in circles. With the creature disorientated, he cut off the stinger to avoid a risk of being poisoned. Darting around the monster, he made quick slices to the joints, forcing it to fall. Quickly the hunter worked on repeating attacking the creature in its underbelly until eventually it fell. The monster hunter stood over the patella and made his final blow. The beast fell limp, and the hunter stood holding the hilt of the sword with both hands. He panted, trying to regain his breath. He slowly leaned forward and laid his forehead on his forearms. He sighed and pulled the sword from the creature, looking around. He set alight to the remaining nest and left the cave to find his attentive horse waiting for him by the entrance. A strong black shire horse with white feet and a white nose looked at him as if displeased with the hunter's dishevelled appearance. He curled his lips at the stallion. "Shuck, don't look at me like that." He took off his sword and approached his stallion. He hauled himself up onto the 5-foot horse and held the reins, patting him on the neck. "Come on, back to the village." Daylight began to break through the horizon, and as he rode to the village, it was deadly quiet, seemingly abandoned. A cold feeling in the pit of his stomach returned. This was not right. Something is wrong, he thought. As he rode to the entrance, there he saw it in the cold light of day, blood everywhere. It looked like there had been a massacre. He rode on through the centre of the village, but it was silent. They were all gone, men, women, children, even their animals. He rode on a little further, but suddenly dizziness took him. He felt a pain in his forearm. He looked down at his arm to see a tear in his armour. Quickly he pulled back the leather sleeve and confirmed his worst fear. He had been poisoned. But he thought he had been careful. He didn't understand how it could have happened. Maybe when the Bitler attacked me, he thought, when I stabbed it in the guts. He gritted his teeth and cursed. Suddenly a movement distracted him. Shuck reared slightly, and the disgraced Nimrod looked and saw a creature that looked like a dog, but it wasn't a dog. It was far too big. It reeked of death, and its skin fell away from its body, rotting as it seemingly looked alive. The hunter's eyes widened. That's what's happened to everyone here, he thought to himself. A large group of Bagasts roamed the village's streets, feasting on any remains of the villagers. The disgraced Nimrod knew these monstrous hounds were not an easy kill, and to kill an entire pack by himself, and poisoned, the odds were stacked against him. He knew it was too late for the village. There was no more the hired hunter could do for them. He turned his stallion, and quickly and quietly he fled. He needed help, and he needed it fast. The venom from the Bitler was known to be the deadliest poison on the Isles. Had the Nimrod been a regular man, he would have died in minutes. Lucky for him, he was not an ordinary man. He pushed his heels into Shuck sides and whipped the reins. "Find me a healer, Shuck," he whispered harshly, eager to ride away from the pack of Bagasts. Well, that was chapter 2, a bit shorter than chapter 1. But if you enjoyed, stick around next week and I will read you chapter 3. So, thank you very much. Bye.